Okay, Chapter 3. Evie. Evie followed the boss down the hallway back to the open office area. Her face was burning like she'd eaten something spicy, and the pace at which the boss was moving wasn't helping with the redness in her neck and cheeks. He just stared at her blankly, completely devoid of all emotion. In fact, she thought she saw the little emotion that was there flicker out the minute he locked eyes with her, as if her silly comment was not even worthy enough to be embarrassed or outraged. My stupidity is profound enough to be acknowledged, damn it! She opened her mouth to say as much, but the boss paused in front of the large wooden doors that led out to the parapet walk and opened them, motioning for her to pass in front of him. Rubbing her damp palms on her skirts, she stepped forward, feeling the rush of the mid morning sun against her skin. Evie wasn't a particular fan of high places, so seeing the distance from where she stood to the ground below caused her to back into the stone edge of the parapet and cling there. You're missing the view. His voice was low and gravelly in a way that made her head tingle like the pitter patter of rain against a roof. I know what Hickory Forest looks like, she said dryly, shutting her eyes tight. But the images of the grand trees beyond were clear. She'd grown up in a village on the outskirts of the forest that took up so much of Renadon's lands. Trees the size of giants blanketed the area surrounding the manor, thick green foliage standing out against a cloudless blue sky. The warm, balmy weather brushing her skin was typical of their kingdom's forgiving climate, attracting all manner of beings to their modest section of the world. Evie finally found enough strength to open her eyes and caught the tail end of a curve in her boss's lips. Glorious. Not glorious, Evie. She needed to be sedated, clearly. The villain continued like she wasn't the blithering mess that she was. I wanted to bring you away from prying ears. He edged closer, his dark hair curling slightly against his tan skin. It's a matter of grave importance. Something about the way he stood, the wind billowing his black cloak about him, gave Evie a great sense of foreboding. Of course, that perfectly rational emotion was overtaken by the less sensible part of her brain that ignored the danger in favor of how attractive he looked. Anyone with common sense knew that the loveliest blades were always the sharpest, but for Evie there was no such thing. Her sense came and went with the wind, nothing common about it. Drawing the tip of her shoe in nervous circles, she looked the boss directly in the eye. Okay, before you go all brooding Earl of Darkness on me, it was a dirty dream, but I meant like dirty. Like with dirt. The brown stuff. It was muddy, and a carriage rolled by and splattered muck over the both of us, and you said, better get this washed, Sage. She could feel that awful tumble of words that spilled out every time she was nervous or an unwelcome quiet appeared, so she continued. It was one of my more ordinary dreams, actually. Nothing explicit or inappropriate. Her arms were flailing now, full-blown wing movements like she was trying to take off. What was worse was the heightened color tinging the sharp angle of his cheekbones and the slight widening of his eyes at the words tumbling from her lips. A smart person would cease speaking at that clearly taken aback expression, but Evie was not smart. Or rather, Evie was smart, but her brain and her mouth seemed to have a swift detachment from each other. Nobody was naked, she said with a confident finality, rocking back on her heels. Nobody was naked? His eyes flashed, and her twisted imagination had the gall to see something burn there for just a moment before they shuddered again. He cleared his throat and scratched the back of his head, seeming a little unnerved. Seeing him lose any ounce of his impeccable composure gave Evie far too much satisfaction. I was not referring to your nighttime imaginings, Sage. His throat bobbed as he walked around her to look at the surroundings. The manor was in part of the forest that was so thick with foliage no one would think to stumble this way. Even Every village in Renadon was intentionally built over natural large gaps in the trees, almost as if the gods created the map of their lands by hand. But Massacre Manor was the exception, living encased by its surroundings, like an armor. The boss braced his hands on either side of the stone pillars. Evie knew his shoulders and back would be tensed beneath his cloak if it wasn't obscuring her view. Sage? Oh, he'd been talking, hadn't he? She'd been far too busy ogling him as if he were the last piece of pie. Oh, yes, I agree. She nodded emphatically, rocking back and forth, doing her best to mask her confusion with a false confidence. Is that so? He whistled low and raised a hand to rub the perfectly maintained stubble at his chin. Well, with your agreement in mind, I'll begin the arrangements to have you married off to one of the river gremlins to allow us safe passage for our shipments from the southern kingdoms. What? Evie gasped. Sir, no, I wasn't. You can't be serious. But he could be. Evie had seen him do far worse to other employees who weren't cooperating, and she'd arranged most of them. Her heart was pounding, blood rushing through her ears, making everything sound muffled. Without realizing it, she'd brought herself closer to him, searching for any ounce of humanity in his black eyes, anything that might take pity on this magicless human with a terrible attention span. But instead of humanity, she saw his eyes squint and crinkle at the corners. Evie took a large step backward to better observe the picture. His lips were curled up at the sides, and when Evie caught sight of them, she yelped. Was that a joke? She almost cringed at the blatant shock in her voice, but her reaction to something so unpredictable could not be contained. His smile widened further than Evie had ever seen it, and a single dimple on his left cheek poked free. And you have dimples? He rolled his eyes, and the dimple disappeared. Just the one, now that I have your full attention. Was that your first? Evie interrupted, unable to process all this new information in an efficient manner. The boss's head knocked back in surprise. My first what, you little tornado? Your first joke. He grunted and opened his mouth to speak, looking quite outraged, if she were being honest. Of all the... He paused to pinch the bridge of his nose. Sage, do you honestly think me incapable of humor? Of course I don't think that, she said earnestly. You hired me. Letting loose a long-suffering sigh, he pushed a strand of dark hair meticulously back into place. I speak to you for less than 3 minutes, and I'm more turned around than the interns during my favorite day of the week. Metaphorically speaking, of course, as I am not shooting arrows at you. Evie gave him a pointed look to reiterate how she disapproved of his self-defense training for the poor souls who came here on internships. Cast-off noblemen's children, people who owed gambling debts, and other general reprobates that alike apply for the entry position all the time. Massacre Manor was a far cry from the kingdom's capital, the gleaming city where most of the interns had stumbled in from. The decadence and abundance so different than the squalor of their new place of employ, for most of them, their first place of employ. Evie had been to the city once as a child. It had been an entire day's ride north from her village, when the forest was still considered safe to travel. She had been too little to remember much, but she recalled the contagious energy of it vibrating the air, remembered vaguely meeting a magical specialist with her parents, and just like the stories children in her village had told her, he had been kind and helpful with seemingly endless knowledge to share. It was nice that quite a few interns had magic, as many of them accomplished their tasks quicker. That sure must be useful for cleaning the toilets, Evie snickered inwardly. But they kept applying, coming back, despite the harshness of the job. The proof was in the pile of letters laden with words of woe, and how a down-on-his-luck son of a noble found himself in deep debt to a very expensive brothel. It was always someone in desperate need of a second chance, And though the danger of the job was well known in less desirable parts of the kingdom, so was the pay. Evie was quite certain the interns made only slightly less than she did, which in any other circumstances might cause her some level of outrage, but she was working for the villain. She would be grateful she held one of the only job positions that didn't call for her scatterday participation. The event took place at the end of every work week, unless, of course, the boss was having a bad day. Then it could be the beginning of the week, the middle of the week, in the morning, during her lunch hour, or, well, she could go on. It was, at the very least, consistent in that every Scatterday consisted of the boss sending the interns outside and having them run from something. So far, she'd watched them try to escape a crossbow and countless magical beasts. But Evie's personal favorite was the day the boss was so fed up with her antics that he began chasing them himself across the back courtyard. It was the fastest she'd ever seen any of them run. I'll remind you, at your bequest, I haven't actually killed an intern in several months. Evie shook her head hopelessly. Sir, I hate to belittle your successes, but there are people who go their entire lives without killing anyone. His face remained serious. How dull. You also can't even really say months, can you? You pushed Joshua Lightenston off this very parapet last week, and he broke his neck. Well, he deserved it. She threw her hands up in defeat. Why? The boss rubbed his chin and grimaced like an unpleasant memory had resurfaced. You said something I didn't like. If I had that luxury, Becky would have been gone over this thing several times already. Evie took a contemplative pause. Actually, sir, no. But what if I make a very official and organized pro-con list? She pleaded. Give me one con to Rebecca Airing as an employee. The breeze picked up, tossing that rebellious dark lock against his forehead. She's determined to be my enemy. His face was suddenly closed again, so suddenly that Evie heard the sharp intake of her breath. Always keep your enemies close, Sage. Life's more interesting that way. The smile he was giving her now held no joy, only cruel promises. Evie swallowed hard, disappointed in herself for needing to take a slow step backward, out of his sphere and back to her senses. Speaking of enemies, maybe get to what I brought you out here to discuss before the other employees begin to believe that I'm throwing you over the edge? He asked. Evie rolled her eyes and motioned her hand forward. Go on. His mouth turned down in a frown as he spun away from her, back to the forest view. Another shipment has been compromised. Evie tried not to groan, but the frustration was palpable. It had taken her weeks to organize that shipment trade-off and plan the perfect undetectable checkpoints between here and the Gleaming City. The office was run on illegal cargo coming in and out, selling it, trading it, stealing it from King Benedict directly most of the time. I suspected as much since I saw the extra. Evie tapped the top of her head slightly with her pointed finger. They were valiant guards. King Benedict's personal guards? They never involved themselves in the villain's business. It was a point of strangeness to her, in fact, that in all the times the villain had struck Benedict by lifting his resources, stealing cargo of all kinds, he'd never struck back. So I assume we didn't make it out with any of the borrowed goods. This trade deal was going to bring in at least 4 large crates filled with weapons from King Benedict's personal collection, depleting them of not only the swords and firearms themselves, but the value of the weapons would no doubt be an enormous loss to their esteemed ruler. Or it would have been, if the whole thing hadn't been blown to bits. My malevolent guards were able to make it out with 2 of them. The malevolent guards were the elite group of people who managed the more violent parts of the villain's business, the field work, some of the interns had coined it. The most ruthless warriors were among them, many of them magic users of varying kinds and educations. Most in the office steered clear of them, but Evie helped Edwin make them sandwiches. Shoot! I forgot to restock the cheese. They are fiends for provolone. That's better than none at all, I suppose, Evie responded. She would accept any small favors if it meant not scouring a map looking for another discreet trade from natural paths in the forest. Always the optimist, aren't you, Sage? His tone was light, but his face told her he didn't think that was a good thing. I like anticipating the good. That way it's easier to see it, even when the bad happens. The boss looked at her with some unreadable emotion. If we could all see the world through your eyes, it would be very colorful. She smiled wide and turned her face up to the breeze. So that's 3 shipments compromised in the last 2 months. 3 too many. His voice was lower suddenly, a deadly tone that she'd seen make the bravest of knights shiver with fear. She, for some reason, found it comforting, which was troubling. Danger isn't attractive, Evie, it's scary. Or it's both, her brain countered. Aside from the little hangman downstairs, how are you planning on handling this? Evie was afraid of the answer, but this was becoming a very distinct pattern. Systems that had worked for them for months were suddenly failing, and the common denominator was becoming very clear. We have a traitor in our midst, he said in a low voice. Evie sucked in a breath because he stood tall and dark, promising destruction, and all she could think was, well, how can I help? Said the gator. You just stole the whole thing out of the kitchen. It's gonna be really bad. Evie was certain the clock on the wall ticked louder when she was trying to focus. Each stroke of the small hand felt like it was grating against her skull. Tick, tick, tick. Evie threw her head down on her desk. She'd been going over the list of employees for the last 2 days in her favorite gold-foiled journal, writing little notes next to their names. Any indicators of suspicion or skewed loyalties had to be recorded. She'd figure out who was sabotaging them, and she'd hand them on a silver platter to her boss. What are you working on? The other grating in her skull. Evie picked her head up and closed her notebook, nearly taking out Rebecca Airing's wandering hand. She quickly returned her quill to her favorite tincture of ink, a gift from her father. Nothing you need concern yourself with. Evie pinched her lips tightly into a smile, trying to keep every inflammatory word inside her head. Why are you making a list of employees' names? I need to know everything that goes on in this office, Becky said with a pompous sniff. Evie considered the woman closely and then leaned her chin against her propped hands. Does that mean you're aware of the office pixies using ink to make self-portraits of their rear ends? The pixies handled small tasks around the office, usually acting as scribes. It was quick work for them, since there were so many, but their erratic temperaments occasionally made them get creative with the ink. A frustrated groan escaped Becky as she straightened and shook her head. Again! She turned quickly, eyes narrowing behind her glasses as she caught sight of the tiny fluttering creatures, all giggling as they scattered the paper about the room. Get over here, you wretches! Becky growled as she stalked away, and Evie breathed a sigh of relief. She grabbed a vanilla drop candy from the tin Lissa had given her and popped it in her mouth. Despite the everlasting animosity between them, Evie did not envy the woman's job. Every little drama, every conflict between the interns or any of the more permanent workers was her responsibility to manage. When the boss had oriented Evie to the rest of the workers, he'd explain the system in which the manor worked, every employee in charge of different tasks in different areas. It reminded Evie of a beehive, Becky's particular specialty being a resource to the humans and other beings, so the boss wouldn't have to deal with the constant melodrama. At the beginning, Evie thought she and Becky could be friends, that whatever stiff coldness lived in the woman during their first meeting would thaw. But despite Evie's every effort, Rebecca Airing was determined not to like her. It was still a mystery whether it was because she found Evie obscenely annoying, or if the rumor Evie had heard from one of the interns was true, that Becky had once upon a time wanted to be the assistant to the villain, and Evie had been given the position instead. Regardless, it was very clear that Evie and Becky would never be friends, and that was just fine with her. Closing the book once more, Evie stood from her desk with her ceramic chalice in hand, praying Edwin had brewed the cauldron of bean juice strong enough to wake the dead. And as she wandered off to the kitchen, though, Evie couldn't help the little voice in her head, wondering if there was an innocence to their feud, or if it could lead Becky down a different path, the one of a traitor. What time is it?
8:52.
Sick, plenty of time. Chapter 4. Evie. Evie spent the rest of the day drowning her sorrows in the mystical effects of the cauldron brew while warily looking at her fellow workers. Someone was guilty. And as much as she'd like it to be Becky, the woman was too much of a staunch rule follower for her to think she'd be capable of that kind of deceit. Groaning as she straightened, she felt her back crack as she twisted and turned. The ache in her muscles was demanding her attention, and she'd finished the suspiciously little work she had to get done before the end of the workday. Any minute the large bell in the north tower would toll, and everyone in the room would scatter back to the monotony of their lives outside of this place. The pixies would return to the wood. Whatever creature was wreaking havoc upon the interns would slink off to its cave. The interns would drag themselves back to whatever hovel they could afford, and the remaining employees would head home as well. There were very few who resided in the manor full-time, Tatiana being one of them, Edwin another, and the only other person keeping the dragon currently in their courtyard calm, a man named Blade. As though thinking of him summoned the charming dragon trainer, she looked up and there he was, striding through the office, a large gash on his forehead. Is Tatiana available? He grinned sheepishly down at Evie, the way he did every time he came in with another injury from the scaled beast they'd acquired shortly after her employment began. Evie shook her head, smiling. I don't know, Mr. Gushigan. Why don't you ask her yourself? Blade leaned down, exposing a large expanse of chiseled chest above his very tight vest. Evie was never certain if he did it ironically, but the dragon trainer always seemed to be wearing colors that drastically opposed each other. Today, his vest was a green so bright that it hurt her eyes, and his pants were an orange that reminded her of sunsets and butterflies. He grabbed his chest and said, So formal, my sweet Evie, you wound me. Evie giggled at the hopeless flirt, closing her catalog of names. She stood up from her desk, then walked around to face him head-on. His amber eyes were warm, much like the rest of his personality. He smiled, his full lips pulling up at the corners, softening the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the narrowed edge of his dimpled chin. Blade was the person in the office closest to her age, only younger than her by a year. I'm not your anything, you big flirt. She reached up to brush his dark shoulder-length hair off his forehead, then grimaced at the skin torn away from his scalp. That thing is going to kill you one of these days. When Blade had first arrived, the dragon was barely the size of her palm, and she'd even held the little creature a few times, cooing at it like it was a defenseless infant. But the beast had grown in just a few short months to an alarming size, snapping and growling at everyone. Only Blade managed to get close, but even he didn't come away from the encounters unscathed. He was the one who'd found the egg, after all, in the mountains to the east. He'd been hiking there, ever the explorer, and found a nest abandoned by the mother. He'd told Evie after the creature hatched that it took to him immediately. He'd bonded with the little beast, couldn't bear to be parted from it, but the upkeep was far more than Blade could afford. Fortunately, it was around that time that he came across an advertisement from someone calling themselves the Villain, requesting any and all magical beasts. So, Blade turned up on the front steps 2 weeks after Evie did, offering the dragon in exchange for a place to sleep and a position as the dragon's trainer. The boss had agreed to his terms, but they'd yet to have any use for the dragon, for many reasons. One of them being that when it wasn't trying to bite Evie's head off, the animal was afraid of everything. Blade's smile widened. That thing is a sweet creature with the occasional temper tantrum. His eyes brightened as he caught sight of Becky moving past them, carrying a stack of papers to the board pinned to the wall. Like you, lovely Rebecca. Becky froze in her tracks, turning her wide-eyed gaze toward them. That is not an appropriate way to address a coworker, Mr. Gushike. Her disapproval practically oozed off her, but to Blade's credit, her disdain didn't seem to faze him. In fact, he seemed to be oddly fueled by her censure. Perhaps we should discuss this further at the Evergreen Tavern. He somehow found the bravery to wink at her. You can read off your very long list of complaints. Pushing her glasses farther up her nose, Becky sniffed and looked at him like something foul she'd stepped in. I would rather drink paint than converse with the likes of you in my free time. The only reason I'm doing so now is because I'm being paid to tell you that your hygiene leaves everything to be desired. She eyed the blood sliding down his cheek, gritting her jaw before adding, Your blood is as offensive as your smell. Take care of both immediately, or you'll find yourself without a paycheck at the end of the week. Evie rolled her eyes as she demon-stormed away. Why do you press her like that? Blade shrugged, using one of his leather wrist cuffs to dab up some of the blood. Because it's fun when she gets ruffled. Eyeing the closed doors, Blade lowered his voice. I've heard there's been another bust on a shipment. How's he handling it? Did you see the entryway? She answered dryly. So, normally, then. Blade chuckled and then froze, remembering how close they were to the villain's office. You can speak freely. He's been everywhere but here the past couple of days. No arson for you today. Blade gave her a mock pout. Evie huffed a laugh, which was unsettling because the man was hardly joking. She'd started quite a few fires since she obtained the job, figuratively and literally. That's not my only job here, you know. He nodded quickly. No, I know. I heard from someone you've cut the boss's destructive tirades down to 2 a week. I don't let him talk to any of the interns before he's eaten breakfast. That's the key. He's crabby on an empty stomach, she said, wondering just how many of their workers' lives were saved because of a frosted pastry. Evie leaned back against her desk, gaze going to the large clock on the wall. The loud clang of the bell rang throughout the room, startling some workers at their desks and causing others to bolt from their seats, their bags already gathered to return home to their loved ones. A few stopped to eye the closed door of the villain's office. It wasn't often the boss was absent at the end of the day. He usually opened his door to indicate he wouldn't kill anyone for making their daily escape. Evie looked at them and nodded with quiet authority. Go on. He's gone for the day. She'll reap the consequences if the boss was angry. Without question, they all scurried toward the hidden door, that bounding of heavy footfalls on the stairs ringing in their wake. Moving to her own bag, Evie packed up her few belongings, trying to ignore the uneasiness she felt. Where in the Deadlands had the villain gone lately? I'm sure he's fine, Blade reassured, waving to Tatiana as she ventured through the hallway into the open room. Hey, Tati! I wasn't worried about him, Evie started, but Blade was already running toward the healer. Tatiana studied his forehead, then gave him a long, suffering expression as she pointed him in the direction of the healer's quarters, following closely behind him. Evie gathered the rest of her things, giving the boss's closed office door one last longing look. Don't care more than you should, Evie. Sighing to herself, she headed for the stairs. Too late. She passed through the doorway, unable to stop herself from glancing back at the villain's closed door again, wondering if one of these times he wouldn't return. What time is it? 9:02. 9:02. Still plenty of time, I think. Yeah, this one's not on me there. Chapter 5. Evie. It tastes watery, Evie's 10-year-old sister Lissa muttered under her breath. Shh! Evie held her finger to her lips as her father moved slowly to the table, his own bowl of soup in his hand. He'd been in a spectacular mood when Evie returned home that day, which meant he would be cooking. Since their father's illness began, he'd found few pleasures, but one of them was that when he felt up to it, he'd cook dinner for his children. It was his way of taking care of them. So even though the things he made often tasted like liquid shoe leather, Evie would be damned if she and Lissa didn't swallow every drop. Because her father cooking meant he was well, and it gave them a taste of what their family was before. Evie looked toward the two empty chairs at the table, one at the opposite end of her father and one beside her. The seats her mother and her older brother, Gideon, had once occupied, but never would again. But still, the chairs sat there, like their memory was haunting them. How is it, girls? Griffin Sage was a large man, with a warm smile and a full head of thick brown hair. In his younger years, he'd been the catch of the town, a man who'd built a successful butchery business from the ground up. Their mother, a foreigner from a lovely string of kingdoms southeast of their continent, Mertalia, Renadon's home along with 5 other kingdoms. Her mother had loved her father to distraction until the incident, until she'd left them. Evie's earliest memories were of her parents laughing together, singing and dancing in their small kitchen. Clearing her throat, she smiled at her father. It's delicious, Papa. Pointedly looking at her little sister, she said, I think Lissa would like seconds. A small foot connected hard with her shin under the table. Chuckling, Evie ladled another large scoop of the lumpy liquid into Lissa's bowl. She wouldn't hope for this lasting sense of lightness, where every living member of her family was well and happy. But there was no rule saying she couldn't try and enjoy it. How's your work at the manor? Her father smiled warmly at her, a healthy glow to his cheeks that she hadn't seen in months. Swallowing a hard lump of potato, Evie began stirring the soup with her spoon, attempting nonchalance. Oh, it's been rather uneventful, actually. I wish I worked in a castle, Lissa pouted, wincing as she took another bite. Evie coughed, nearly choking. It's it's not a castle, Lissa. It's simply a manor house. But it's probably as big as a castle, isn't it? Her sister looked at her with wide, questioning eyes. Evie loved far too much about her job, the people, the strategy, but she hated this part, the lying. She couldn't tell her family a single truth about what she was really doing. As far as they and the rest of the village were concerned, the villain was a vile, reprehensible creature. Anyone even hinted to be associated with him was punished to the full extent the law allowed. But even knowing she could one day be found out, knowing that the wrath of the kingdom could so swiftly descend upon her, did not scare her. If anything, it excited her. She was as reckless as her mother. It's very large, yes. Evie took a bracing sip of the wine she'd purchased on her way home, doing her best to divert the subject. How are your lessons coming? To her relief, that single question set Lissa on a tirade about the boy in her class who wouldn't stop pulling on her braids. Evie sighed into the welcome distraction of Lissa's innocent life. What she wouldn't give for just a touch of that youthful bliss. Evie was only 23 years old, and yet she felt like she'd lived a lifetime. Between the way she took care of her family and the mistreatment she'd been dealt by those crueler and larger than she, it was a wonder her hair hadn't gone gray. It's a wonder you made it to 23 at all with the ridiculous situations you get yourself into. She supposed that was why she reconciled her work so easily in her mind. She had no idea what the villain's end goal was, aside from doing everything to screw over the king. But Evie knew the important things. He didn't take advantage of his female employees, he paid all of his workers fairly, and he requested his cauldron brew with at least a pound of sugar. The last fact was not as relevant as the other virtues, but it was Evie's favorite. Every morning, she'd have to sneak his preferred amount of sugar out of the kitchen, along with cream from the chilled box, and add both to his drink as discreetly as possible. She was uncertain why he was so embarrassed about his preference, but she supposed it wasn't good for his reputation to enjoy such frivolities. She loved even more that she was one of the only ones who knew. So much so that she found herself staring dazedly at the wall, smiling as her pulse quickened. Her father finished his plate, clearing the table and placing the wooden bowls into the bucket near the stove. Evie stood so quickly her chair wobbled. I'll take care of those, Papa. She smiled and patted his arm, ignoring the frown marring his cheeks. Evangelina, I am perfectly capable of. Would you tell me one of your stories? Lissa tugged at their father's arm with a wide grin, then gave Evie a knowing look that made her seem much older than she was. Her sister wasn't completely untouched by the harshness of the world, no matter how Evie tried to shield her. The two of them sat down again, and Evie stiffened slightly as her father settled in her mother's chair. Lissa crawled into his lap, and looking up as he dove into one of his many stories of villains and the heroes who defeated them. Her throat tightened as she swallowed the truth that she now worked for those he despised. Turning back toward the bucket, Evie gripped the rag and scrubbed at a pot harshly. She felt her cheeks sting and her heart begin to pound around her shortened breaths. Feeling the water beneath her hands, she closed her eyes for a moment and began humming a light melody of a song her mother so often favored when she tended the dishes. It was comforting to Evie somehow, despite all the pain her mother wrought. That tune was one of the last good things her mother had given her before that day, before the dandelion fields, just before. Evie caught a reflection in the glass of the window in front of her, saw her father behind her carrying a dozing Lissa towards her room. Looking back at her own face, Evie felt her lips pull up in a smile, one she'd practiced so many times before. Even when she felt like her lungs would collapse, even when her heart felt like it would give out from the strain, she'd always managed to tug her lips upward. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. Worry not, Hasibi. You could fix a broken world with just your smile. She had been wrong, of course. Evie hadn't fixed anything that day, or in the days that came after. But Evie still smiled, just in case. And not for the last time, hoped it was enough to keep those she cared about safe. What time is it?
It is 11 after.
9?
Yeah.
Sick. I like this system of you telling me the time instead of me trying to see it on my phone, because Discord's ass
Booty.
about that.
Discord's being a butt.
As long as I'm recording, it doesn't want to tell me shit. It's like, we're not going to show you how much battery you have left, what time it is, nothing.
Oh, do you want to know what time it is? Get fucked.
Yeah, no, it doesn't let me touch anything.
So rude. Also, the dragon trainer, the second you started describing him, I'm like, is this Albus Dumbledore or Arthur Weasley? With just how horrible he dresses.
Chapter 6. The Villain. She was humming again. Tristan Arthur Mavreen, or more affectionately known to the public as the Villain, tapped his long fingers against his sleek black desk. The noise should have irritated him. It should have grated against his skull. He already had a headache after hearing laughter from the other workers outside his door. Being evil wasn't supposed to be joyful, and his migraine was proof. But he kept his anger contained. He'd gotten most of it out at the beginning of the week anyhow, and the Valiant Guards he'd happily slaughtered and hung from the rafters for all to see. Again, the lightness of her voice flitted through the small, open crack of his office door. If it were anyone else, he was certain he'd yank the door open and demand the infuriating sound cease immediately. He'd threaten and intimidate until they were shaking with fear and his reputation was solidified in their minds once more. It was safer for him and for them. But it wasn't just anyone. It was Sage, which was the only way he could think of her. Having to work close enough to smell her vanilla scent was more familiarity than a person should need. Like a fool, he moved closer to the door and set his ear against it. He had to know what song it was. It had to be something she enjoyed often enough to memorize the tune. Or perhaps it was whack. Reeling back, he held his hand to his nose as a bark of pain left his lips. He'd been so preoccupied by her song choice, he didn't even notice the sound moving closer. There was no humming now, just shocked silence, and his befuddled assistant standing on the other side of the open door that had just made direct contact with his face. Her elegant nose scrunched up as she took a cautious step backwards, hands fluttering in front of her. Oops! Then her bow-shaped lips pulled into a wide smile, and suddenly the pain in his face was nothing compared to the fist squeezing his chest. I'm so sorry, sir. I should have knocked first. She shrugged her small shoulders as if to say, what are we going to do with me? He had a few ideas. Shaking his head, he glared down at her. Is there a reason you barreled into my office like a wrecking ball, Sage, or were you just hoping to assault me with my own door? Her light eyes widened as she stepped around him and deeper into his personal space, as if she wasn't already invading every other area of his life. Assault is a bit strong, isn't it? I'm sure you've been hit harder, in far more vulnerable places. She paused for a moment, seeming to consider the words she'd just spoken. The working of her mind was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was almost as if every thought, every word said, made the nonsensical wheels of her mind turn until she could make sense of them in her own specific way. It was surprisingly intriguing. It was disgustingly distracting, and he hated it. And then she'd say something that would just render him speechless, like, "Not that I'm thinking about your vulnerable places. I mean, I am now because I said it, but I mean vulnerable like you're." She paused, and for some unfathomable reason, he needed to know how she'd finish that sentence, so he just waited. Your ear. That familiar, annoying buoyancy whirled through him, making him feel vile things like joy and the unmistakable need to laugh. He stared hard at her. The delighted glimmer in her eyes, the high points of her cheeks, the slight uptick of her lip, like she was always ready to smile at a moment's notice. Blowing out a breath and running a hand up to smooth his hair down, he turned back towards his desk. He needed to regain some level of footing. "My patience is thin this morning, Sage." "As opposed to every other morning, sir?" Tristan walked around his desk and seated himself in his chair, ignoring Kingsley as the frog seemingly moved closer to Sage. Kingsley had sat on his desk every day for the past nearly 10 years, giving Tristan quiet, unwanted counsel with his ridiculous one-worded signs. It was incredible how the amphibian only needed one word to irritate. It was a talent. Tristan motioned with his hand for Sage to take one of the smaller seats opposite his desk. He never mentioned that those seats hadn't been there before her employment began 5 short months ago. He never wanted to encourage any of his workers to be relaxed enough in his presence to sit. But it was practical to have them now that he had a right hand to brief daily. It had nothing to do with wanting her to be comfortable. Nothing at all. She quirked a dark brow and settled into the open seat, her bright yellow skirt swishing around her legs. Her dark locks were pinned back in her usual braid, one lone curl always escaping to lay against her cheek. Her smile warmed when she saw Kingsley hop closer to her, nudging his green head into Sage's hand. "Good morning, my little king," Sage said, adjusting his crown. "Don't you look handsome this morning?" Kingsley made a gurgled ribbit of approval. Sage gently scooped the frog into the palms of her hands and nuzzled him against her cheek. Naturally, Tristan began planning the amphibian's demise at the sight. "Sage, do not make a pet of my prisoners." "Then stop having adorable prisoners." She winked at Kingsley before placing the treacherous creature back on his desk. "Point taken," he conceded, putting both hands up in submission. He sighed and tried to come back to who he was before this natural disaster of a person entered his hemisphere. "You are evil incarnate. The world fears the very mention of your name, a cold-blooded killer." A sudden small squeak came out of her, sounding suspiciously like a sneeze. She looked up at him sheepishly. He was a puddle on the floor, and every speck of dust in that room was his enemy. "Proceed," he bit out through his clenched jaw. Her pale hands were on his desk then, sliding a sheet of paper towards him. "I compiled a list of every employee here, giving as much detail as I could about them. I'm sure Becky or Tatiana would have been more intel should you need it. Tatiana loves her secrets, and Becky keeps records so pristine she should work for the Kingdom's Council." It surprised him that Sage should give Miss Airing any sort of compliment. He was aware of the bizarre feud between them, though he was loath to admit it. He found it mildly entertaining. He looked down at the top paper in the pile. Her neat script was scrawled across the page. The names of every employee with multiple anecdotes written beside each one. It was an extensive amount of detail, and had probably taken her hours. Clearing his throat, he gave her a rare look of approval. Well done, Sage. He picked up the rest of the papers in the pile, leafing through them slowly. This will be a considerable help. She beamed at him, and he felt a disgusting, festering sort of sensation begin to stir. He watched her nonsense wheels begin to turn behind her eyes once more. Sir. He put the papers down, giving her his full attention. Something amiss? She folded her hands together, fidgeting. I'm just wondering, instead of doing all this back-end work, why not just question everyone until you find the culprit? And this was why he'd hired. Well, one of the reasons. She was smart, conniving in a way she couldn't quite see, but there was a quiet ruthlessness to her that was so disarming, coming from someone who seemed to dole out kindness like it was candy. Do you mean to ask, why am I not torturing everyone under my employ until someone confesses? Her cheeks went red, which had a humbling effect on him. A mock look of outrage crossed her delicate features. Of course not, she sputtered. A dry, low chuckle escaped his throat before he could cough it back down. Then Tristan leaned forward onto his elbows. Rest assured, Sage. The thought did cross my mind. But I don't just want to find the person who's been ruining all our hard-earned plans. He paused, watching as she leaned in too, like she was mesmerized by him. But that was impossible. I don't want them to see me coming. Her eyebrows shot up in understanding, and he added, I want them to sit wherever they're sitting in this office right now, thinking they've gotten away with it, that they'll continue to get away with it. All the while, we whittle away at their identity behind closed doors. I want them to feel safe. And just when they think they are truly in the clear, I will destroy them. He waited for the fear to flash on her face, waited for the disgust to settle in, but instead, a knowing smile spread across her lips. A twinkle formed in her eyes, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And you know, if the traitor finds out you're looking for them, they'll inform the person they're answering to, and you want to take them by surprise, too. He couldn't catch the drop of his jaw in time. Yes, that's exactly it. Her grin turned to one of her full, beaming smiles, like there was a joy in understanding his mind. We're not ruling anyone out, by the way. I'm on there, too. This surprised him more than anything, because of course she should be on the list. Nobody was ever truly innocent. Least of all this secretly maniacal cyclone sitting across from him, even if he knew it wasn't her. Take your name off the list, he said gruffly. Sage shook her head, frowning at him. I shouldn't get special treatment. It could easily be me. I work the closest with you. It quite literally cannot be you. His eyes roved the small glittering gold mark that circled her pinky finger and then back to her face. Her eyes followed his, and a dawn of understanding overtook her features. Oh, yes, the employment bargain. Bargain keepers were not easy to come by, nor was the magical ink used to make the bargain themselves. The one Tristan kept on staff cost him a fortune every time he used his services. It's why the employee bargains were typically only done in green to his malevolent guards.
One drink down.
They acted as the villain's guards and personal spies when the situation called for it. With the green inked bargains, Tristan was ensured that his guards never betrayed him. Once a new guard agreed to the posting with their signature, they'd be bound to Tristan's life force with the inked-on ring. If anything happened to the villain at their hands, the green ink would turn to a poison, seeping into their bloodstreams and killing them swiftly. Loyalty was easy to acquire when the only other option was death. He'd originally intended to give Sage a green ring with the little ink he had left from his last purchase. But when the bargain keeper had arrived, he couldn't go through with it. He'd picked the gold instead. I couldn't betray you even if I wanted to, she said resolutely, eyeing the thing with a hint of wistfulness. I can't say I'm upset about being eliminated from the suspect list. The work this person's ruined for me alone is enough to make me want to torture someone. He enjoyed pushing her a little too far, sometimes a habit he'd like to shove under his boot. I have a couple of poor sops in the dungeons downstairs, if you want to try your hand. He wasn't being serious. She pushed up from her chair, turning back toward the door, looking discomfited. Good. She made it nearly the whole way before she paused and glanced back at him. I would, torture someone? She clarified, an alarming sincerity on her face. If I knew it would help you. If it was someone hurting you, I'd do it. And I'd probably enjoy it. Just a little. With that, she spun on her heel, her sunny dress offsetting the weight of her words. Tristan rubbed his chest, feeling everything she'd said break shards out of the walls he'd built, feeling the cracks all the way to the blood roaring in his ears. He cursed, pushing back from the chair and turning to the window in the corner to stare out at the horizon. He peeked back toward his desk, where Kingsley watched him with an almost sympathetic expression before holding up one of his signs that read, Trouble. No shit. Tristan whipped back toward the window, trying to slow his breathing. The damn organ between his ribs continued to pound relentlessly. He cursed again, gripping the windowsill until his knuckles turned white, but his heart wouldn't slow, as if insisting on reminding him that he had one. Time.
28 after. Why did that last sip just hit me so much harder than the other sips?
What are we doing? Water?
The last sip was a freaking Tillman Dew. I just took the last bit of it, and I felt it. It felt like it was going to come up and out my nose. So I'm like, what the fuck is wrong?
Why?
I don't know. Why body do?
Why body do?
Confused. Why body? Why do? What for?
Oh my god. Okay. Chapter 7. Evie. Evie was going to scream. She had spent the entire day discreetly walking back and forth among different sectors of the office space, idly overhearing conversations, trying to catch a whiff of something. But the only focus among the staff was what tavern they meet up for drinks at the day's end, or who was sleeping with whom in the coat room. The latter, Evie would admit, she was mildly curious about. She desperately wanted to confide in Tatiana about their office rat, but to her devastation, there was no way she could rule her out as a suspect. Not yet, anyway. In fact, looking over the surroundings that had become as familiar as a worn pair of gloves, Evie realized there was not a single person in this room she could trust. Well, save for the villain himself, and the irony in that. It was alarming, the helpless, sinking feeling of betrayal that spread through her. It all felt so personal. It wasn't her agenda being uprooted, but it felt like it. She'd spent so much of her precious time making sure every ounce of effort and focus went to the success of the company. It was more than the work itself, though. It was the people she was surrounded by. There was no pretense of being better here. They were all flawed enough to compromise any fantasy of moralistic value in favor of survival. It was beautifully comforting in a world that had done its best to make Evie feel tragically alone. Sighing and standing up from her seat, her small journal in hand, she did a loop around the room, then headed to the office's surprisingly spacious kitchen area. She gave a greeting to Edwin as she walked in, feeling a brush of warmth at the oven's heat. Miss Evie, Edwin called with a jaunty bow before taking a tray of flaky bread from the oven. Have a pastry, I insist. Like all other ogres, Edwin was nearly as tall as the ceiling with glowing turquoise skin. His smile was wide and friendly, and those things were only complemented by his spectacles that were just a few sizes too small. He was also smart as a whip and always said things that made Evie think for a long while after he said them, and they both loved books. Evie nodded at the open novel propped on the table. In a moment, perhaps. What are we reading today? Oh, you'd like this one, Miss Evie. The ogre winked at her, and the metal of his eyewear moved with the motion. It's a romance. Is it now? Evie beamed at him. Go visit your window. I'll fill you a chalice. He nodded toward the other end of the kitchen, where soft light was peeking through. Evie smiled knowingly and headed in that direction. There were many beautifully designed windows throughout the manor, but this private area tucked into the corner was her favorite. The tiles were haphazardly placed in a design that altogether formed the shape of a vibrant sun shining its light down on an old book. An accurate depiction in Evie's eyes, since a good book often felt like the same comfort as the heat of sunlight brushing your cheeks. She'd spent much of her time in this kitchen, venting her frustrations to Edwin, but more so to this shining piece of art. Sometimes, in the whisper of quiet, it almost felt like it answered her back. Becky would occasionally wander into the kitchen and make a snide comment that Evie would be forced to answer with one of her own. It had become part of the routine she'd grown oddly accustomed to. Eventually, Evie stood up and headed back to the office. She'd just walked up to her desk again when she thought she heard a slight clicking coming from somewhere in the room. Her gaze wandered to the large clock on the wall, the second hand gliding as an uneasy feeling twisted in her gut. Evie looked around to see if perhaps someone else had noticed the sound, but the low hum of voices and heads bent towards their desks told her she was the only one to note it. It was probably nothing, but that swirl of unease seemed to bloom into a flood of anxiety that made it difficult for her to focus on anything else. She was tempted to retrieve her boss, wherever the Deadlands he had wandered off to. After their briefing that morning, he'd stormed out in a hurry, not bothering to tell anyone where he was going, which on any other day wouldn't have bothered her. He'd always had his secrets, that air of mystery that aided his dark reputation. But lately, it nagged at her that he trusted her with so much, and yet so little. She dared to want more of him, and that thought alone was far too dangerous to explore further. Click, click, click. Letting loose a little growl of frustration, Evie tried to tune out the rest of the room to better hear the rhythmic sound. Was it getting louder? She tested it, wandering farther to one part of the room than the other, waiting for the noise to go from faint to blaring where it was the loudest, if her building suspicions were correct. And they were. The noise would lead her right to her desk. Well, not exactly, but close. A small croaking sound permeated the air over the clicking, and Evie looked down to find Kingsley sitting beside the tip of her shoe, wide eyes searching hers, trying to convey something he couldn't express. Well, hello, my lovely friend. Evie slowly knelt to the ground and held out her hand, and the frog did the smallest hop into her palm. You must be more careful when hopping the office floors, Kingsley. If you found yourself squished under a wayward boot, how would we all go on? She smiled at him, forgetting the clicking only for a moment before it struck once more. Kingsley seemed to hear it too, because the frog leaped from her palm and toward the one place Evie had hoped she wouldn't have to look, through the doors beyond her desk, into the boss's office. Sighing, Evie walked toward the door, now slightly ajar, and pushed it all the way open. Her instincts were screaming at her to not move a step farther, but it was as if a string had been tied between her and the mysterious noise, one that would not be broken until she found it. The large space seemed smaller without the villain inside. The desk didn't give her the same heart-palpitating feeling she normally had when she saw it, most likely because a certain someone wasn't occupying the chair behind it. She should leave. She was going to leave. Until Kingsley leaped onto the desk with another one of his signs, and this one showed a singular word that chilled her. Danger. A small voice in her head told her that she should heed the frog's warning. She shouldn't have been in this office without permission anyway, and she certainly shouldn't be rustling through his desk for what probably was just a broken clock or perhaps a particularly noisy weapon. But it was too late to listen to his small voices when her own was screaming at her, "Look inside the desk. It's not like the frog will tattle." She muttered the word, echoing in the quiet as she rubbed her head. When she walked closer, her nerves steeled themselves, despite the odd sense of satisfaction at finally finding the source. She bent low, the skirts of her dress brushing the floor, reaching a hesitant hand up. Evie grasped a small, cool object, carefully bringing it out and holding it up for inspection. The clicking was now screeching at her, though the object itself looked very unassuming. Turning it over, Evie's moment of victory was fast replaced with overwhelming fear. Of course, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Sighing a ragged breath tinged in annoyance, she said to only herself, "Of course it's a bomb." Time.
39. Of course it's a bomb.
Chapter 8. Evie. Everything seemed to move slower at first. The air stilled along with her as she stared down in abject horror at the little device sitting against her palm. Then her heart began to catch up at the moment of impending doom, and she felt it pound so hard that she gasped for breath. Her free hand flew up to clutch at her chest, begging it to slow. She couldn't think. She couldn't do anything. The device was gold and rectangular, a tiny timepiece dangling lightly off the bottom. With a shaking gentleness, Evie moved her hand to turn the round timepiece over. When her eyes found what they were looking for, her already cold blood froze solid, binding her stiffened limbs tightly together. 3 minutes. Only 3 minutes before the small gold-tipped arrows pointed to the 12 on the top. A ringing began in her ears, one so piercing that it made her want to throw the device to the ground and squeeze both of her hands to the sides of her head. A ragged breath escaped her lips, along with a light sob. She was hysterical, and she was wasting time. Get rid of it! She clutched the device, peeking at the timepiece once more. 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. She thought about tossing it out the window, but Blade and the dragon trainer directly below the villain's office window, so that option was out. Maybe if she could contain the blast, perhaps she could spare just a few people. Keep the castle standing, at the very least. She looked up to see Kingsley watching her with a new word on his tiny sign. Run. Throwing the doors open with one hand, Evie exploded into the main office space, ignoring the people stopping to stare at her. A few caught sight of the device in her pale fingers and gasped, diving out of her way as she searched for a place to get rid of the thing. A voice which, under different circumstances, would grate at her, grounded her in its familiarity. The parapet! Evie turned towards Becky, who swung the door to the outside open, waving her hands frantically for Evie to move. And move Evie did. She burst into a sprint and ran into the cool, open air, puffing a quiet "Thank you" to the woman as she passed. Evie had to have been in some sort of adrenaline fog because she thought she saw concern on Becky's pinched face. The heat of the summer sun hit the top of Evie's head, the first time it had appeared from behind the clouds all morning. Her heart was racing, her skirts kicking up around her with each furious step. The device remained cool in her hands, despite her rising body temperature, the ticking a cruel reminder. You want the ticking, she reminded herself. No ticking means you're dead. And if she could just get to the end, she could send the device over the small rise at the end of the parapet. She could save the manor, or most of it, at least. More importantly, she could save the people inside. Had the parapet always been this long? It felt like she wasn't even close to the end. She pushed her legs to the brink and ran harder, watching her destination grow closer and closer, still not fast enough. She impossibly pushed herself farther, nearly reaching the end when, no, the stiletto heel of her boot snagged against a loose cement block, bending her ankle unnaturally as she stumbled. Evie watched in horror as the bomb slipped from her fingers, sailing through the air, watched it soar up, high, high enough that it skimmed the top of the stone rise, but it didn't make it over. It clanged down, landing far too close to keep her from the blast. Oh, God, Evie whispered, diving to remove her heel from the hole it was now wedged into. Her breathing was so short that her vision began to blur, the tips of her fingers beginning to bleed from scraping against the rough surface of the brick where the heel of her boot was stuck. But it wasn't budging. Realization hit like a cool mist. She turned toward the opposite end of the parapet, towards the doors at the other end. This is it. She'd never make it in time. She had forgotten to hug Lissa before she sent her off to school that morning, had of course assumed she would get another chance. She'd yelled to her father that she'd loved him, but had he heard her? Did he know? A different face flashed in her mind. The boss. The villain. Evie couldn't believe she was leaving him now when he needed her most. Who would make him begrudgingly smile now? As a lone tear ran down Evie's face, she thought that must be the saddest thing of all. Time.
45.
Can we stop there and not piss everybody off?
I mean, I thought you were going to stop at the end of chapter 7 and be like, it's a bomb! And then done.
Yeah. That would have been so
diabolical.
That would have been so rude.
And satisfying and diabolical all at the same time. It would have been chef's kiss.
Yeah, I think we'll pause here.
Heard, Jeff.
Heard, Jeff. I mean, we did read like 5 chapters.
Yeah.
And so I read a lot today, you guys. I don't know when I hear it.
Well, what did you start on? Chapter